What would you do if the man who once risked his life for your freedom was thrown out of a restaurant for ordering a bowl of soup, not for shouting, not for stealing, not for causing trouble, just for existing, on a cold Friday night, while families laughed over steak dinners and waiters carried trays of hot food? A quiet, elderly man sat alone in the corner of a busy restaurant. His clothes were worn, his boots were cracked, his hands trembled slightly as he held a spoon over a simple bowl of soup. No one in that room knew that those same hands had once carried wounded soldiers to safety. No one knew that the faded jacket he wore represented years of sacrifice. And no one cared until the manager walked up to his table and said 5 words that would change everything. "You need to leave, right now." The entire restaurant went silent. The veteran looked up, confused, embarrassed, humiliated. He hadn't asked for charity. He hadn't asked for attention. He had $12 in his pocket, just enough for soup, but apparently not enough to belong. What happened next was caught on camera, and within hours, millions of people were watching. Anger exploded across social media. Veterans demanded answers. Customers called for boycotts. But the most powerful response didn't come from the internet. It came from one man, one phone call, and a past that refused to stay buried. Because the homeless man they threw out, he wasn't just anyone. He was a decorated soldier, a leader, a hero who had once saved lives on the battlefield. And when someone from his past saw the video, everything changed. This isn't just a story about a restaurant. It's about pride. It's about dignity. It's about how quickly the world judges a person by their appearance, and how powerful it can be when someone chooses to stand up instead. Stay with me until the end, because what happens after that phone call will restore your faith in humanity, and it will remind you of one powerful truth. Sometimes, the person sitting quietly in the corner is the strongest person in the room. The entire restaurant fell silent the moment the manager's voice cut through the air. "You need to leave, right now." Forks froze halfway in mouths. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft background music seemed to disappear. It was a packed Friday evening at Riverside Grill. The warm glow of hanging lights reflected off polished wooden tables. The smell of grilled chicken, buttery rolls, and fresh coffee filled the room. Families celebrated birthdays. Couples leaned across tables whispering. Waiters hurried back and forth balancing trays heavy with food. And in the far corner near the window sat a man most people had tried not to notice. His name was Walter Hayes. He looked to be in his late 60s. His gray beard was uneven, his hair slightly overgrown beneath a faded military cap. His jacket, an old army field coat, was worn at the elbows, the fabric thinning from years of use. The boots on his feet were scuffed and cracked. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed something else. On the left side of that jacket, carefully stitched and still intact, was a small patch of the American flag. Walter hadn't stepped inside the restaurant to cause trouble. He hadn't come to ask for handouts. He had walked nearly 3 miles that evening, holding a few folded bills in his pocket, the last of his money until the following week. He was hungry, really hungry. For the past 2 days, he had survived on crackers and coffee from a gas station. His stomach ached as he pushed open the restaurant door. The warmth inside felt almost unreal against the chilly evening air. For a moment, he hesitated. Places like this weren't meant for men who slept in shelters. He knew that. He could feel the eyes the second he walked in, the quick glances, the subtle wrinkles of noses, the judgment that came before a single word was spoken. But hunger has a way of pushing pride aside. A young hostess greeted him with a polite but uncertain smile. "Table for one?" "Yes, ma'am," Walter answered softly. She grabbed a menu and led him to a small table near the back, away from the center of the dining room. It wasn't intentional cruelty. It was just easier that way. Walter sat down carefully, almost as if he were afraid the chair might reject him too. He opened the menu and studied the prices. Burgers, steaks, pasta, everything seemed expensive. His fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the menu. He counted his money under the table, $12.40. He swallowed. When the waitress approached, he offered a small, respectful nod. "I'll just have the soup of the day," he said, "and water is fine." No appetizer, no main dish, no dessert, just soup. The waitress wrote it down without comment, though her eyes lingered on him for a second longer than necessary. As Walter waited, his mind drifted, like it often did, to another time, a time when he wore a pressed uniform instead of a worn jacket, when his boots were polished, when people stood when he entered a room, when yes, sir, followed his name. He remembered the desert heat during deployment, the sound of helicopters overhead, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He remembered the men he served with, brothers who had trusted him with their lives. He had been proud then, so proud. The soup arrived in a white ceramic bowl. Steam rose gently from the surface. The smell alone made his stomach twist with anticipation. "Careful, it's hot," the waitress said. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. Walter picked up a spoon and took a slow sip. It was simple chicken noodle soup, nothing fancy. But to him, it tasted like comfort, like dignity. For a few quiet minutes, everything felt almost normal, but not everyone in the restaurant was comfortable. At a nearby table, a well-dressed couple whispered behind their menus. The woman glanced over repeatedly. The man leaned closer to murmur something in her ear. She frowned. Walter didn't hear their words, but he felt the weight of their stares. He kept his eyes on his bowl. Then it happened. As he reached into his pocket to double-check his money, a few coins slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. The sharp metallic sound echoed more than it should have. Several heads turned. Walter immediately bent down to gather the coins. His hands trembled slightly, not from age alone, but from the growing awareness that every movement was being watched. "I'm sorry," he muttered quietly, though no one had spoken to him yet. Across the room, the well-dressed woman waved at a passing staff member. Moments later, the restaurant manager, Mr. Klein, appeared. He was a tall man in a crisp button-down shirt and tie. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. It was irritated. He approached Walter's table with tight, controlled steps. "Sir," Mr. Klein said, his voice low but firm, "we've had some complaints." Walter looked up, confused. "Complaints? You're making some of our guests uncomfortable." Walter blinked slowly. "I'm just eating my soup." The manager glanced at the nearly empty bowl. "This isn't appropriate." "Appropriate?" Walter repeated, genuinely puzzled. Mr. Klein straightened his posture. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words landed harder than any shout. Walter felt the heat rise to his face. Around him, the restaurant had grown quieter. Not completely silent, but quiet enough to feel exposed. "I haven't done anything wrong," Walter said softly. "It's best if you go," the manager replied. "This establishment has standards." Standards. The word echoed painfully in Walter's mind. He slowly placed a spoon down. He reached into his pocket, carefully this time, and placed his crumpled bills and scattered coins onto the table. "I was going to pay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That won't be necessary," the manager replied coldly. Walter pushed himself up from the chair. For a brief second he stood tall, almost instinctively, shoulders back like the soldier he once was. "I serve this country," he said quietly. "I didn't think I was disturbing anyone." But the manager had already turned away. Walter picked up his cap, adjusted it gently on his head, and walked toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. And just like that, a man who had once risked everything for his country stepped back out into the night, with an empty stomach and a broken sense of dignity. What Walter didn't know was that someone had witnessed everything, and this was only the beginning. The cold air outside felt sharper than before. Walter pulled his old military jacket tighter around his chest as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The restaurant door shut behind him with a heavy click, a sound that felt final. For a moment, he just stood there. Cars passed. Laughter echoed faintly from inside. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But inside Walter, something had shifted. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was humiliation. He walked a few steps away from the entrance and slowly lowered himself onto the curb. His knees ached from the long walk earlier, and now the weight of embarrassment made them feel even weaker. He rested his elbows on his legs and stared at the ground. He had faced enemy fire without flinching. He had carried injured soldiers across dangerous terrain. But being asked to leave a restaurant over a bowl of soup, that hurt in a different way. I guess some battles don't end, he murmured quietly to himself. Inside the restaurant, conversation slowly returned, but not for everyone. At a table near the center of the room sat a young woman named Emily Carter. She hadn't touched her food since the manager's voice rang out. Emily was in her late 20s, a graduate student studying social work. Her grandfather had served in the military. She grew up listening to his stories about sacrifice, loyalty, and brotherhood. She remembered how proud he looked whenever he wore his old cap. When she saw Walter's jacket and that small American flag patch, something stirred inside her. And when she heard the words, "This establishment has standards," her heart dropped. Without fully thinking it through, Emily had lifted her phone when the manager approached Walter. She didn't plan to record at first, but something told her this moment mattered. Now, as she replayed the short clip on her screen, her hands trembled. It was all there. Walter's quiet voice, the manager's cold tone, the coins hitting the floor, the silence of the room. Emily looked around. Some diners avoided eye contact. Others whispered again, but now their whispers sounded uncertain. She stood up, ignoring her half-eaten meal. She grabbed her coat and headed outside. Walter was still sitting on the curb, staring ahead blankly. Emily approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Sir?" she said gently. Walter looked up, blinking as if pulled from a distant memory. "Yes, ma'am." Emily swallowed. I wanted to say thank you for your service." For a second, Walter didn't respond. Then a faint smile appeared. "Not many people say that anymore," he replied. "My grandfather served," Emily added quickly. "He used to say the hardest part wasn't war, it was coming home." Walter nodded slowly. He wasn't wrong. Emily hesitated before speaking again. "Can I buy you dinner somewhere else?" "Please." Walter shook his head politely. "I appreciate it, miss, but I don't want charity." "It's not charity," she insisted softly. He gave her a look that was kind but firm. "I just wanted to pay for my soup like anyone else." The words hit her harder than she expected. Emily glanced down at her phone. "Sir, would you mind if I share what happened? People should know." Walter looked confused. "Shared." "Online," she explained. "So people see how you were treated." He paused. At his age, the internet felt like another world entirely. "If you think it'll help someone," he said finally, "do what you think is right." Emily nodded. That night, sitting at her small apartment desk, she uploaded the video. She didn't add dramatic music. She didn't exaggerate the story. She simply wrote, "A veteran was just asked to leave a restaurant for making guests uncomfortable. He only ordered soup." Then she hit post. At first, nothing happened. A few likes, a couple of comments. Then, within an hour, the shares began. By midnight, the video had thousands of views. By 2 a.m., it had tens of thousands. Comments flooded in. How could they treat him like that? "This is disgusting. Find this man. He deserves better." Veterans began tagging military support groups. Local community pages reshared the post. Influencers picked it up. The outrage grew louder with every passing minute. By morning, the video had crossed into the hundreds of thousands of views, and the restaurant's phone wouldn't stop ringing. At Riverside Grill, manager Mr. Klein arrived early, unaware of the storm waiting for him. The hostess rushed toward him. "Have you seen the internet?" "What are you talking about?" he snapped impatiently. She turned her phone toward him. His face went pale as he watched the clip. The angle clearly showed him standing over Walter. The audio captured every word. "This establishment has standards." The comments beneath were brutal. "Boycott this place." "Shame on you." "Veterans deserve respect." Reservations were being canceled one after another. Negative reviews poured in online. News stations left voicemails requesting statements. Mr. Klein's hands tightened around his phone. "It's out of context," he muttered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Meanwhile, across town, the video reached someone unexpected. Colonel James Whitaker, now retired from active service. Colonel Whitaker was a respected figure in the community, a successful business owner and leader of a local veterans foundation. He had been scrolling through his morning news when the video autoplayed. At first, he watched casually. Then he leaned closer to the screen. The man in the worn jacket, the familiar posture, the way he said, "I serve this country." Whitaker's breath caught. "Walter," he whispered. He replayed the clip again, this time focusing on the face. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. Walter Hayes had once saved Whitaker's life during an overseas mission, and now he was sitting on a curb, being thrown out over soup. Whitaker stood immediately. He didn't leave an angry comment. He didn't share the video. He picked up his phone and made one call, not to the restaurant, not to the media, but to his assistant. "Find him," Whitaker said firmly. "Find Walter Hayes." There was no hesitation in his voice. The storm online was growing louder, but what Walter didn't know, as he spent another night at the shelter, was that something much bigger had been set in motion, and one phone call from an old friend was about to change everything. By the next afternoon, the story had spread far beyond the small town. News stations replayed the video. Radio hosts debated it. Social media was still buzzing with outrage. What started as a quiet humiliation inside a restaurant had now become a national conversation about dignity, respect, and how veterans are treated after they come home. But while the internet argued, Colonel James Whitaker focused on action. By noon, his assistant had tracked Walter down to a nearby veterans shelter on the edge of town. It wasn't hard. The staff there knew exactly who Walter Hayes was. "He keeps to himself," one of the volunteers said. "Never asks for much." Colonel Whitaker didn't wait another minute. Before heading to the shelter, however, he made one important stop. Riverside Grill. A black SUV pulled into the restaurant parking lot. The vehicle itself wasn't flashy, but the presence stepping out of it carried undeniable authority. Colonel Whitaker adjusted his suit jacket. On his chest, neatly pinned, were several military medals. He didn't wear them often, but today wasn't ordinary. Local reporters, already covering the developing story, noticed him immediately. Cameras turned. Microphones lifted. "Colonel Whitaker, are you here about the viral video?" One reporter called out. Whitaker gave a brief nod, but didn't stop walking. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was tense. Staff members whispered nervously. The lunch crowd was thin, far thinner than usual. Manager Mr. Klein stood near the counter, rubbing his temples when the door opened. He looked up and froze. The colonel approached calmly. "Mr. Klein?" Whitaker asked. "Yes," the manager replied cautiously. "I'd like a word." They stepped into a small office near the kitchen. The door closed behind them. Whitaker didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult or threaten. Instead, he placed his phone on the desk and played the video. The room filled with Walter's soft voice once again. "I serve this country." When the clip ended, silence lingered. "Do you know who that man is?" Whitaker asked evenly. Mr. Klein swallowed. "A homeless man who—" "He is Sergeant Walter Hayes," Whitaker interrupted firmly. "A decorated veteran. A man who saved lives under enemy fire. A man who led soldiers with courage." The manager's posture shifted uncomfortably. "He ordered soup," Whitaker continued, "and you treated him like he didn't belong." Mr. Klein attempted to defend himself. Customers were uncomfortable. "I had to think about the business." Whitaker's gaze sharpened. "And what kind of business do you want to be?" he asked quietly. "One that turns away a hungry veteran because he doesn't look wealthy enough?" The question hung heavy in the air. "I'm not here to destroy you," Whitaker added. "I'm here to remind you what leadership looks like." For the first time, the manager's confident mask began to crack. "What do you want?" Mr. Klein asked. "I want you to understand the weight of what you did," Whitaker said. "And I want you to make it right, not because the internet is watching, but because it's the right thing to do." Outside, cameras continued rolling. An hour later, Riverside Grill released a public statement. The restaurant formally apologized to Walter Hayes. They announced mandatory staff training focused on compassion and inclusivity. They pledged a significant donation to a local veterans support organization. But Whitaker wasn't finished. He left the restaurant and drove straight to the shelter. Inside, Walter sat at a small folding table, sipping weak coffee from a paper cup. He had no idea what was unfolding outside those walls. When the shelter director approached him and said, "There's someone here to see you," Walter looked confused. Then he saw him. "Colonel," Walter whispered, standing abruptly. Time seemed to collapse between them. They hadn't seen each other in nearly 3 decades. Whitaker stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his old friend. "You stubborn old soldier," Whitaker said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you call me?" Walter gave a small, embarrassed smile. "Didn't want to be a burden." Whitaker pulled back, looking him straight in the eye. "You carried me out of a war zone," he said firmly. "You were never a burden." The shelter staff quietly stepped away, giving the 2 men privacy. They sat down together. Whitaker listened as Walter shared pieces of his story. The medical bills after his wife's illness, the depression that followed her passing, the slow unraveling of stability. Pride had kept him from asking for help. By the time he realized he needed it, he didn't know where to turn. "You're not alone anymore," Whitaker said. And he meant it. Within days, real change began. Whitaker worked with his foundation to secure Walter temporary housing. Not a cot in a crowded room, but a small furnished apartment. He connected him with VA representatives who expedited his benefits review. Medical appointments were scheduled, counseling services arranged. Walter resisted at first. "This is too much," he insisted. "It's not charity," Whitaker reminded him gently. "It's earned." But the biggest surprise came a week later. Whitaker invited Walter to speak at a gathering for young military recruits and community members. "You don't need to give a perfect speech," Whitaker said. "Just tell the truth." Standing behind a podium for the first time in years, Walter felt his hands shake. But when he began speaking, something familiar returned. Strength. He spoke about service, about brotherhood, about the invisible battles many veterans face after coming home. He didn't mention the restaurant with anger. Instead, he talked about dignity. The room stood in applause. Word spread quickly about Walter's story, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. 2 weeks later, something remarkable happened. Walter walked back into Riverside Grill. But this time, everything felt different. He wore clean clothes. His beard was trimmed. His posture was upright and steady. The staff greeted him immediately. "Welcome back, Sergeant Hayes," the hostess said respectfully. The manager himself approached. "I owe you an apology," Mr. Klein said sincerely. "I failed you." Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We all fail sometimes," Walter replied. "What matters is what we do next." He sat down at a table, not hidden in the corner, but in the center of the room. This time, when the soup arrived, the entire staff stood a little taller. And when other diners recognized him from the news, they didn't stare with judgment. They nodded with respect. Walter took a slow spoonful. It tasted the same as before. But everything else had changed. Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to make one call, to remind the world that dignity should never be conditional, and that heroes don't stop being heroes, even when life knocks them down.